Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another ESOP Centre webinar hosted by my company, Zien, and the FS Club. And we have with us today, as part of his series, David Craddock, to talk about the case for employee share ownership, which should be a very interesting talk. Now, David really is one of the world's leading experts in employee share ownership. He's an independent consultant specialising in the topic, and he really is one of the leading recognised authorities on this subject. And he is the author of the Tolley's Guide to Employee Share Schemes, and many other papers and books on the topic. And I think many of you know him and are familiar with his work, which is one of the reasons why you're here. I'm your chairman today. I'm Ian Harris. I'm one of the directors of the Zien Group, and it's an absolute pleasure once again to host David for this session. This is a fairly easy job for me at this stage, because really it's my job to just introduce David and then get out of the way. The agenda is straightforward. My introduction, I hope it won't be as long as 5 minutes. Then we'll have the keynote address from David for about 20 or 25 minutes. During that time, we would love you to send in questions using the GoToWebinar system for questions. We've got 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end. This is very often people's favorite part of the event, where we can get a little bit deeper into some of the topics. And if you have some burning questions for David, please do send them in. David loves answering those questions. Please do use the GoToWebinar facility for asking questions. If you send me or David an email in the background, we would be delighted to receive emails from you, but we will receive them after the webinar and won't be able to address them during the webinar. So during the webinar, we'll be looking at the questions that come in this way. Just before I hand over to David, I would like to say a word of thanks to our sponsors at the FS Club, and also to the members of the ESOP Centre. This is a very warm and generous collection of clients and organisations who have allowed us to have this webinar programme to cover a huge variety of topics, including employee share ownership schemes. And we're really very, very grateful to these Financial Services Club members and sponsors, and also to the ESOP Centre members and sponsors. These are they. Many of you will be here today listening, I'm sure. And we really are very grateful to you. We wouldn't be able to do this without your help and your support, and we are thrilled to be getting so much of all of that. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to David. I will switch off my microphone and camera to give David front and center stage, but take my word for it, I am here, and I will be gathering in the questions, listening very carefully to what David is saying while David speaks. David, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Ian. Thank you ever so much for that introduction, and thank you also to the sponsors. We're very grateful for their support. And today we're talking about the case for employee share ownership, the heart of the matter revealed. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, that's introducing my practice, David Craddock Consultancy Services. Ian's already done that, so without more ado, let's get into the heart of the matter revealed. So it's important to set out before you at the outset what I consider to be the underlying principles, the prism through which the whole of this presentation should be seen, what I call the core revelation. What is the heart of the matter, the core revelation of employee share ownership? Well, it's important to look at it from the point of view of the mindset of the employee and the mindset of the company. So from the perspective of the employee mindset, this lies right at the very heart of the matter, the core revelation. The employees will be more inclined to develop capital value for the company if they have a stake in the capital value that they are creating. I will say that again, it is so important. The employees will be more inclined to develop capital value for the company if they have a stake in the capital value that they are creating. In other words, if they're part of the employee share scheme arrangements, and they can align their interest with the interest of the existing shareholders. But what about the perspective of the existing company's shareholders, their mindset? We've got to bring the two mindsets together, the mindset of the employees and the mindset of the existing company shareholders. Well, let me illustrate that through the question which I've set out on this slide, a question which supports the principle employee share ownership is integral to the economics of business growth. The existing shareholders are wanting to grow their company in order to enhance the value of the company, and therefore the germane question, the pertinent question is this: is it better to own 100% of a company worth, say, £500,000 for illustration's sake, or to own 75% of a company worth 5 million? The answer is, well, a no-brainer, is it not? And how does the company grow from one to the other? How does the company grow from a company worth 500,000 to a company worth 5 million? Motivation is the answer. Employee motivation. Right at the heart of that employee motivation lies the employee share scheme. So yes, it is better to have 75% of a company worth considerably more than a smaller company where you actually own 100%. Let's go to the next slide. So yes, the design and the structure of the employee share scheme. Employee share schemes is truly a multidisciplinary subject, and to be a consultant, a practitioner in the realm of employee share schemes, you need to have knowledge of a whole plethora of laws and regulations, and the greater your mastery of these areas of law and practice, the stronger will be your consultancy. Securities laws, financial services laws, tax laws, employment laws, trust laws, data protection laws, with due application in all the countries in which the employees are based. So if we have a UK holding company, let's say, with subsidiaries in France and Spain and the US, we need to understand these laws as they relate to all those countries. When you're actually designing or reviewing an employee share scheme, and over the last, there it is, nearly 40 years now, I've designed many employee share schemes and reviewed many employee share schemes that have come to me that other people have created, whether it be through my helpline or whatever means. It's always easy in the first instance to identify the broad category in which a share scheme arises. It will either be a share gifting scheme, or a share purchase scheme, or a share option scheme. So a share option scheme is, of course, a form of deferred purchase scheme, and there are many nuances and permutations and combinations on those themes, but in broad terms, gifting scheme, purchase scheme, or share option scheme. In the UK, we have the so-called UK tax advantage schemes. Historically, we've referred to them as the UK tax-approved schemes. This is where we have a bespoke piece of legislation specifically enacted by Parliament in order to actually facilitate the introduction of an employee share scheme. The equivalent in the US are the US tax qualifying schemes, or US tax qualifying plans, as they call them over there. If we use the word scheme in the US, of course, they think we're referring to some activity of the mafia, which we're clearly not. So we call them plans in order to bridge that cultural gap. And really, they're the only two countries in the world which have this thoroughly comprehensive set of tax relieving arrangements which are built into statutes. We do have various reliefs and exemptions in other parts of the world, but nothing to compare with the US and the UK. And those reliefs will either defer tax liabilities, or they'll substitute the more punitive income tax regime for the less punitive capital gains tax regime, or best of all, they will provide exemptions from tax, provided certain conditions are met. Ironically, the one country in the world where employee share schemes is de facto compulsory, courtesy of the Black Empowerment legislation, is South Africa. And I go down there from time to time, and we're working with non-tax relieving legislation in the main, although of late certain tax reliefs have been introduced, but nothing to compare with that plethora of tax reliefs and exemptions which we have in the UK and the US. Okay, let's go to the next slide. The definition. And here I'm looking at the human resources dimension. So I've talked about the laws, but so important, of course, is the human resources dimension and the communication. I provided a definition here that employee share ownership is the establishment of an entitlement for the employees to participation in the benefits that flow from a share interest in the share capital of the company in which they're employed. That might be a direct actual share interest, or it might be a share option over shares in the company. So let's come on to the strength of the communication strategy in this next little bullet, the key question. The employee communication strategy, combined with the effective human resources management and strong administrative structures, is the lubricant that connects the employee workforce to the employee share scheme. So when all the I's have been dotted and the T's have been crossed, it's the communication strategy, the management of the human resource dimension, which makes or breaks the success of the scheme. It's connecting the employee share scheme to the minds of the employee workforce. And so the key question, therefore, is how does the human brain think? The human brain of the employees think? How does the human heart of the employees beat in response to the employee share ownership initiative? Now, there is significant, very significant research on the effectiveness of employee share schemes coming out of the US and the UK. I have produced a very detailed paper on that research, which is included on the ESOP Centre website, if ever of you want to avail yourself of that facility. But in summary terms, it comes down to this: identification and involvement, the identification of the employees with the business and their sense of involvement in the business through their involvement in the employee share scheme. Motivation and incentive, loads of research done on that, which actually leads to enhanced productivity and in turn enhanced profitability of the business. And that, of course, is both on the income side and the expenditure side. When employees are involved in an employee share scheme, they're aware of expanding the top line income, but also aware of actually making savings on the expenditure and keeping the expenditure cost base of the company down, therefore widening the margin at both sides. And also recruitment and retention. Employee share schemes are powerful in recruiting employees and once recruited, retaining them. And indeed, at very senior levels, and not necessarily very senior levels, at middle management levels and sometimes below, employees will expect these days to actually be part of an employee share scheme arrangement. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So these are two concepts I wish to introduce to you in a new novel way, maybe, but they're two concepts which come out of the work of Louis Kelso, who introduced the first modern day ESOP back in 1956 in Palo Alto, California. The case company was Peninsula Newspapers. Louis Kelso was an economist and a lawyer, practiced in both those disciplines, and developed these concepts, firstly, of identity of interest, whereby the employees, through the employee share scheme, can unite around the totem of the developing share value with everybody who's involved in the development of the business, whether it be other employees or management employees, or indeed, very importantly, the existing shareholders. And to illustrate this principle today, I've come up with this idea, which I take from the French philosopher Voltaire. Those of you acquainted with classical literature, a beautiful phrase: let us cultivate our garden together. And I've identified there the portion of Candide by Voltaire where it arises. Candide said, "Neither need you tell me that we must take care of the garden." The illustration being, of course, we must take care of our company. "You were in the right," said Pangloss, "for when man was put into the Garden of Eden, it was an intent to dress it and to prove that man was not born to be idle." So we're not idle in our companies. We work hard in our companies to cultivate our garden, and we unite in that endeavor around that developing share value, the identity of interest, that concept which Louis Kelso gave us so beautifully back in his writings on binary economics in the 1950s and 60s, and indeed going into the 70s. Then the wages of capital, So this is where employee share ownership provides us with the opportunity to widen the remuneration base through which employees are rewarded. Yes, historically, employees are rewarded through wages, capitals, pay, but through involvement in the employee share scheme, they have the opportunity to be rewarded through dividends and indeed through capital gain. And to conclude this slide, I've included a quote from a very famous football manager of many years back, Brian Clough. Very controversial football manager in the United Kingdom. But he used to say this when he was instructing his players on how to play the beautiful game, as we call it, the game of football or soccer, as they refer to it in the US, and indeed we sometimes refer to it here. Look after the ball, and the ball will look after you. Be skillful with the ball, take care of the ball, caress the ball, pass the ball in a beautiful way to the other players, and the ball will look after you. So I take that illustration. I said I got some novel illustrations for you this morning. Look after your employee share ownership program and look after your employees. And yes, your employee share ownership program and your employees will look after you. Where would I be without my employees? Okay, employee share ownership, look after that program, look after the employees, and they will look after you. Let's go to the next slide. What I call the human resources dynamic. This is all part of going right into the heart of the matter, understanding how employee share schemes works. So important, this human potential dynamic. And I've split this up into 3 points. The release of entrepreneurial spirit within companies. So you want your employees to be working for you, but thinking like employees, yes? Contributing ideas and creativity to the business and being thoroughly accountable, resolving that potential conflict between having the freedom to create and also being accountable. So the release of entrepreneurial spirit within companies. Secondly, the realization of the human potential of employees. So here we're appealing to the natural human instinct of the employees, which encourages co-creation with other employees at all levels of the business. And I picked out here a classical reference from Greek philosophy, Aristotle. Aristotle used to talk about enlightened self-interest. Well, it's in the enlightened self-interest of the employees to give of their efforts and their endeavors to develop the business. Remember that first maxim from the first slide, that the employees are going to be more inclined to develop capital value for the company if they have a stake in the capital value that they are creating. So that's to be contrasted with Plato, who talked about a sacrificial approach to life. Well, in employee share ownership, Aristotle wins every time because of the appeal to that natural human instinct. And enlightened self-interest is the fuel that drives the car. We refer to it within our office. Enlightened self-interest, the fuel that drives the car. Employee share ownership is the fuel that drives the car of the business forward to higher and higher levels of prosperity and growth and development. And then this final point on the human potential dynamic, the regulation of business through progressive employment empowerment policies. So all the evidence shows that employee share ownership works best when it's combined with a progressive approach to training, a meaningful approach to performance management, involvement in decision taking through works councils and works groups and quality circles and performance management, performance quality management. So are these legal requirements? No. They're involvements in employee activity that the company has a choice to introduce, and then the employees respond accordingly. And so I've included this quote from Edmund Burke: manners are more important than laws because it is upon manners that laws depend. So when we're actually fostering the human potential dynamic within our employee share ownership company, we're actually introducing policies to encourage progressive and effective behavior, good behavior, if you like, to develop the value of the business. Next slide, please, Ian. Thank you. So where do we go for the origins of employee share ownership? Well, my research has taken me into many channels over the last 40 years, but I've not really found anything earlier than the Commonwealth Protectorate, where an individual by the name of Peter Cornelius Plochhoy, nonetheless, wrote it very extensively about the concept of cooperation in the workplace, akin, of course, to the concept of the Commonwealth, which was being developed at the time by Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector of all England, at a very, very important time in the development of our history here in the UK. So Plochhoy established one of the first cooperative commonwealths, a business commonwealth, you might call it, a worker type cooperative. He did this in 1659, and it is said that Plochhoy's writings inspired the establishment of the Scott Bader Commonwealth in 1951, and indeed influenced John Spedden Lewis, the founder of the John Lewis Partnership. I think that was earlier. I think that was somewhere around 1929, I think. Yes, 1929, at the start of the Great Depression. In the UK, prior to 1978, when the first profit-sharing employee share scheme was introduced, employee share ownership was known as the Quiet Revolution. It quietly developed. Spirited individuals, sometimes motivated by Christian ethics, sometimes by humanitarian ethic, sometimes by genuine care for their employees, but a very focused approach to developing industrial relations in a way which was thoroughly ethical. And it was called the Quiet Revolution. People plugging away at it, but never any major breakthrough on a national scale. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, the South Metropolitan Gas Company, 1889. I've included this case This is the first employee share scheme of any recognizable employee share scheme design that we would recognize in the modern era that I've actually found in history of the United Kingdom, and obviously United Kingdom founded in 1920. We're going back to Great Britain. 1889, the South Metropolitan Gas Company. It recorded the scheme in its minutes under the name co-partnership. So let me just take you through the elements, and you'll recognise that the elements that we sometimes see in various types of share schemes today. Under the arrangement, part of the employee's bonus was invested in the shares of the company. Do we recognise that? Yeah. The partnership model for the share incentive plan, I think. It wasn't called that in 1889. Some 10 years later, in 1898, 1899, the company introduced elective employee directors from those employees who had completed at least 10 years service and had at least £180 invested in company shares. So involving them in the decision-making of the business, an empowerment policy, surely, an archetypal empowerment policy, bringing them to be involved in company decision taking. And the scheme developed with certain guarantees on retention, under which the employees were not the shares were not sold without permission. The employees had to obtain the permission of the company to sell their shares. And at the same time, the employees were encouraged to buy more shares. Think of it in the modern era: buy one, get one free. It wasn't called that in 1889 or 1899. But that's the concept: buy one, get one free. They were encouraged to buy more shares from their own resources. On leaving the company or on death, the employees were bought back by the company from the employees. So that established quite an important principle, that the employee share scheme is designed to motivate the employees while they're in the involvement of the company. If they leave the company, then they forfeit their shares. And what value they forfeit for the shares depends upon the design of the scheme arrangement. Let's go on to the next slide. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, International Congress of Profit Sharing was held in Paris in 1889. Was this coincidental? There is some evidence that representatives from the South Metropolitan Gas Company were actually present at that conference. It established some very, very important principles. It established that employee share ownership, to be effective, must be set within the context of industrial partnership and employee education, the all-important communication plan. At the outset, when you launch the employee share scheme, and then of course during the ongoing life of the scheme. And secondly, it established employee share schemes and profit sharing as sister policies. Yes, as sister policies. Ultimately, of course, coming to fruition in 1978, when the Lib-Lap Pact introduced the profit sharing employee share scheme, the first tax approved employee share scheme to find its way onto the statute book. Next slide. So the modern day experience, well, we have that Lib-Lap Pact experience in 1978. Margaret Thatcher, of course, and indeed John Major embraced employee share ownership as a long lost friend. In 1980, the same related share option scheme was an all employee scheme in order to make a strong contribution to solving the industrial relations problems of the time. British Leyland, Red Robbo, and all that. And the 1984 executive share option scheme in order to motivate the business activities of senior executives and directors. The new Labour initiatives through Finance Act 2000, Gordon Brown embraced employee share ownership like a long lost friend. He saw it as embracing that ethic of hard work, which he'd always believed in through the whole of his life, and presumably still does. And also, of course, the concept of redistribution, but this time not redistribution through Social Security, redistribution through the returns for that hard work, that endeavour, and that effort. And then we come to the coalition, the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition led by David Cameron and Nick Clegg, and we find there the embracing of the so-called enterprise reliefs, enterprise investment scheme, enterprise management incentives, and of course entrepreneurs reliefs, with a special entrepreneurs relief for enterprise management incentives. Let's go to the next slide. Yes, the golden era, we might call it, the coalition government, which introduced, well, the shares for rights scheme. That didn't last long, but what has lasted longer is the 2014 initiative, the Employee Ownership Trust Arrangement. We also had in that period an evolution of the employment-related securities legislation, first introduced in 2003. Next slide. Okay, yeah, so throughout this period, the concept of the employee share trust, what I call the historical employee share trust, as opposed to the employee ownership trust, developed as the market for the shares, working alongside the employee share schemes and providing a market for the shares in the absence of a recognized stock exchange market, which is available to the quoted sector. Let's go to the next slide. Political objectives vary. Under the Conservative Party, there was an emphasis upon this identity of interest in industrial relations, improving industrial relations, but also a recognition of employee share schemes providing an opportunity and a contribution toward self-sufficiency and self-reliance for individual employees. The beauty of employee share schemes is that it combines individual return with cooperative type working, team working, as we love to call it. Labour Party, well, their main concern was productivity and profitability, as expressed in a very well written paper by Gordon Brown at the time. Enterprise with fairness, facilitating redistribution through wealth creation. And then when we come to the coalition, encouraging enterprise, helping starter businesses, and minimizing the bureaucracy attached to employee share schemes to make them more accessible to companies and more workable for companies. Next slide. One of the wonders of employee share scheme is it has political consensus right across the House of Commons. For the Conservative political persuasion, well, it represents proprietorial rights. For the capitalist political persuasion, it represents benefits of ownership. For the liberal political persuasion, individualism and freedom. For the socialist political mindset, well, some form of redistribution of wealth. Consensus political persuasion, a practical basis for unity. And for the economic political persuasion, well, it represents a basis for economic delivery, which is what most people in business, including myself, are interested in. Comparison with the USA and Europe, well, we have that great example I've already alluded to, Peninsula newspapers, which I've expounded on through various other webinars developed by Louis Kelso. And of course, in Europe, with the disintegration of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the formal enactment of the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, the way was open for market economics to survive, and with it, employee share ownership. Let's go to the next slide. The forerunner of the subject. Okay, US. Why has employee share ownership developed so powerfully in the US, and why is it a forerunner ahead of any activity in the UK or anywhere else in the world? Well, let me tell you a little story briefly about immigration into the US. So the immigrants go in mainly from the East Coast. Some come in from the West Coast, typically those of Spanish orientation. But coming in from the West Coast, people from all dispositions and ethnic groups from Europe, looking for success in the new world of the Americas. So the immigrants come in, they take the land. They keep coming in, they take more of the land. Eventually, the whole of the land is taken, but the immigrants keep coming. So what do? Do you fight over the land? Of course you don't. This is the new world. This is the new world of the Americas. No, you enter into cooperative arrangements as to how to work the land together. And that's the reason. I've researched this heavily, but both through writings in the US and in the UK and Europe. This is the reason why America was the forerunner in employee share ownership. It has this powerful history of working together. Let's go to the next slide. So, an electronics company based in Northern California. This is an interesting case study. This is a company which introduced employee share ownership in order to develop corporate glue. An interesting facet of that particular case study is most of the shares are actually concentrated in the hands of employees, but it's quoted on NASDAQ. So you get supplies, an uneven supply of shares going onto the market. Another case from the US, a circuit boards manufacturer based in Silicon Valley, following in many ways a UK model, but also establishing a very inventive scheme which allowed for trading in the shares. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, what about the positioning in Europe? Well, France, of course, has long had a very, very powerful scheme, the French qualifying plan, and a history of savings. And indeed, my message for Europe is we can't introduce a monolithic uniform scheme across the whole of Europe. What we have to do is we have to encourage the principles of employee share ownership within the European community, and then allow each individual country to develop the schemes which would reflect their culture and be effective within their business environment. Next slide. Thank you, Ian. I think this is the last slide. That's something about the French experience. And the final point about the social market economy in Germany. When I was talking with Ian actually last month, he said I mentioned to him about the work I've done on the social market economy in Germany, and he said, dig out your notes, David, see if there's any relevance here. So I've tagged it on at the end, this idea of what Jeremy Lehman, in his book, The Political Economy of West Germany, calls the deproletization and decentralization of the German economy. By deproletization, he means inclusiveness, and by decentralization, he means individual empowerment. Again, testimony to the natural fit of employee share schemes within the social market model. So that's my case for employee share ownership. The heart of the matter revealed. Questions? I'm always keen to help you as much as I possibly can with questions. Thank you, Ian.
David, thank you so much. That really was a fascinating talk, and to some extent you've covered the area that I would have wanted to plow with my questions by preempting that with this business about empowerment and involvement. And if we've got some time, I might come back to that and ask you some more questions about that side of it. But you've covered it really nicely in your talk, and we've still got time for a few questions. There's one question here from Susan, your fan. She says it's a great presentation. She would like to know, do you think, or how can employee share ownership help to enrich businesses during a difficult time like this COVID-19 pandemic? So this is a cup half full question about, in difficult times, how can employee share ownership help to enrich businesses? I've got one or two cup half empty questions.
So this is a
follow,
cup half, isn't it?
Thank you, cup half full one.
Thank you, Susan, for that question. It's a great question, and I can give you some very practical answers. As companies seek to recover from the impact of COVID, and in the UK, the furlough period, and the equivalent in the US, companies may not have the resources to pay competitive salaries, but they will have the opportunity to actually introduce employee share schemes. So this is the widening of the remuneration base. This is what Louis Kelso all those years back called the wages of capital. The wages might be at a lower level, but we can actually give employees employee share scheme activity with the opportunity to receive dividends and also capital gain. There's also a more subtle point as well, which comes out of the fact that employee share schemes policies work best alongside employee empowerment policies, like decision taking and progressive training schemes and so forth, quality circles, whatever it might be. And this is personal responsibility. The evidence shows that employee share ownership encourages personal responsibility in the workplace. Well, have we ever needed personal responsibility in the workplace more than we do now? The social distancing, the washing of hands, the wearing of masks, the being very careful not to contract the disease. So hopefully that gives you some flavour, Susan, as to how employee share schemes is very relevant in this time. There's also, of course, companies coming back to the UK, the supply chain coming back to the UK, and the supply chain coming back to the US from China and various other companies in the Far East, with, I'm hoping, increasing employment levels as a consequence. We need employee share schemes in order to motivate those starter businesses. Hope that helps anyway.
Thank you for that, David. Here's the first of the cup half empty questions, which is thinking about companies that already have employee share schemes and have made a large number of, or might have made a large number of redundancies as a result of what's going on, or indeed at any time of recession or difficulty. Do employees being made redundant have any legal rights to retain their employee shares or options? And it's quite a detailed question. Some companies have clauses written into their employment contracts saying that employees who leave must surrender all their unvested shares and options to the company. This is especially the case in smaller ones, where they're worried about control implications. And do you have any views on what best practice might be in this regard?
Yes, interesting. The first part of the question is a structural answer. It depends on what is stated in the employee share scheme contract, whether it be a share option contract or a share purchase contract. What does it say? Normally, the employee share scheme contract will be separate from the employment contract. This is purposeful. All design or practitioners advise that element of design so that if employees leave, they don't have massive claims upon the company for employee share scheme benefits foregone, future employee share scheme benefits foregone. So that's a structural part to my answer. Okay, employees who are made redundant. Just remind me again of the second part of the answer of the question, Ian.
So the second part of the question: do you have any views on what good practice might be in this regard?
Yeah,
I mean,
that's
are there some general points you can make about good practice, or
okay.
you just have to look at these things case by case?
Yeah, historically, the best practice has been seen to recognise that employee share schemes are for individuals whilst they're in the employment of the company, so that when they leave the company, they leave the employee share scheme. Now, as to what value they take with them, clearly they have hopefully developed some value for the company whilst they've been a member of the scheme. So the Articles of Association will typically lay out the basis for the sale of the shares, whether it be at pro rata market value or minority interest market value, or a position to be negotiated between employee and company on leaving. So all of that is around in the market, and we do that for our clients. Increasingly, there's been a voice to say employees should keep their shares. I'm not saying that's a majority voice, and it's not one necessarily that I advocate, but there are practitioners who do advocate that, and it's particularly relevant to companies that are working towards a sale of the company, a trade sale at some point in the future, and value is not going to accrue to that company until that point of sale. But those employees who've left will have contributed in the early stages, maybe in the midpoint stages, to the development of that value, and therefore some recognition should be given. So the argument goes to them keeping their shares once they've left the company. So it does depend very much on the company. Employee share schemes is a very individual thing. We do actually do, you know, by company, we do actually have these tax approved schemes and tax qualifying plans in the US, as they call them there. But it's always a question of bespoking the arrangement to be suitable for the company in which you're working. There is a certain uniformity amongst the quoted companies these days. There wasn't when I started in this subject all those decades ago. But within the private companies, there's room for enormous innovation and creativity and bespoke type arrangements by company.
Yeah. I find this side of it absolutely fascinating. I mean, our own experience at Zien was to set up a trust structure for share incentives that actually is a very broad church. It's not just theoretically, it's not just for employees. Associates could participate through the trust structure as well. Although, of course, when we ended up actually forming an employee share ownership scheme and take advantage of the tax regulations, then that bit of it was limited through the tax regulations to the employees. And in reality, we have never used the broader church of the trust that we set up to sorry, I say never. Up till this point in time, we have not used that element of the structure, but the trust deed is still there. And our feeling when we first set the thing up, and I'm talking about 25 years ago, and our practice is a little bit different now from the way that it was then. But our thinking then and our philosophy then was to think about people working with an organization like ours as a wider thing than just employment. One of the things that we were reacting to in the professional world was this notion that you were either an employee who was working, heart and soul 24/7 for the professional practice, or you were an associate who was on a list somewhere and wasn't really part of us, and we would never. We certainly wouldn't want very much to do with you, but if we happened to need your specialism at some point, we might just work with you on one project. And we felt that there was a whole world in between that we wanted to get involved with, and we've done, I think, well at doing that, but we have never actually moved our share incentives down that line up until now. Maybe its time is yet to come.
Well, it's an interesting observation, Ian, and thank you for sharing that. The involvement of self-employed consultants or self-employed contractors is not unusual for private companies, and we can actually introduce those arrangements on a tax-efficient basis, working with the general tax legislation, not the bespoke tax legislation. In the US, I've seen increasingly in the last 10 years, a desire to actually involve suppliers in a share scheme, which is a much more advanced, all-inclusive type approach. And the whole concept of employee share schemes, if you remember from that identity of interest illustration that I used from Louis Kelso, is to unite everybody involved in the company around the totem of the developing share value. So it's thoroughly consistent with that ethic.
I agree, and actually I made that little example really to seed the next question, which I think will be the last question, which is a fascinating question that's come in from John Hicks, where he's asking, in a post-COVID-19 world, would he be interested in your view on extending employee control as part of new business models? And he's saying, in his experience, share benefits also have the ability to influence and encourage diversity, and that can be beneficial to the company beyond the financial incentives. And he'd just like your reflections on that.
Yes, I mean, employee share schemes and share schemes generally, whether it be for employees or non-employees, is ultimately a business decision. The intention is to motivate people toward higher levels of productivity and profitability. But the fact of the matter is, of course, it contributes to the healthy environment in which people are operating, the open environment, the trust between employees and management. And yes, in this post-COVID world, we're looking at different demographic factors, different sociological factors of how people are working, increasingly people working from home. So whereas they may have been working in an office, let's say 10, 20 people together, they're now working from their homes. And the expectation is that some of that will continue for a long time and maybe forever. So if you're going to have people working in different units, i.e. their own homes, you still want to maintain that unity and maybe some compensatory element. By compensatory, I'm talking about ethically, some compensatory element of not working together physically in order to maintain that sense of unity. Could well be more employee share schemes to bind them together, working from the different units of their own homes. So there's a lot of thinking that I'm putting in to actually how employee share schemes can have new manifestations in this post-COVID world. I think there's also a recognition that there is this heightened sense of personal responsibility required in the workplace. I already alluded that in response to that question from Susan. And that again is pertinent to my answer to you there, John.
David, thank you very much for that. We're pretty much out of time. I would just like to spend the last couple of minutes on thank yous. Once again, I would like to thank the members and sponsors of the Financial Services Club, the FS Club, and the member sponsors of the ESOP Centre for enabling us to do webinars like this one. I would also like to just point out to everyone who's out there, if you're not aware of these resources, the ESOP Centre has Newspad available, excellent in-depth coverage of everything you want to know about what's going on in the world of employee share ownership. That comes out monthly. We have bulletins through FS Club on a myriad of topics, including employee share ownership. I would encourage you to take a look at those and to subscribe if that interests you. We're getting very, very good feedback on these bulletins. And just to point out a few forthcoming webinars, we are doing a slightly reduced service in August, but we're still doing plenty. We've got on the 19th at lunchtime the COVID crisis effects on the financial services industry. On the 25th, we've got a case study with Fair Banking Foundations on accredited ethical banking. If you're a fan of me, I shall be chairing that one. And on the 27th of August at 2 o'clock, Financial Centres of the World focus on Toronto. So that really just leaves me to thank David. those of you who've been following this little series will know that I've been, because we can't have a round of applause in the way that we would like, I've been trying to find musical instruments to help me to do this. And as David is doing several of these, I'm running out of musical instruments. My wife suggested that I play a power chord on my 4-string Renaissance guitar. So I'm not sure that these two things go together. The interesting thing, of course, about the Renaissance guitar for this purpose is that power chords are fifths, and fifths were very popular in the Renaissance period. So this sound is actually a Renaissance sound as well as a power sound. And I thought I'd go for the D5 power chord, D for David, and the fifth is A, so DA for David. And it sounds like this in Renaissance style, which is rather a nice sound. Or if you do it as a power chord, thank you very much, David.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ian. Great to work with you again.
And you, David. Many thanks to the audience as well. I hope you enjoyed it. David, we'll see you again soon. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.